and welcome to our video from the Emerging Technologies Research Lab. I'm Shanti Sumartayo and this is
Melissa Duque.
And we're going to talk today about attuning to places and spaces when you're first starting out a project, a design ethnographic project. So Melissa and I were both able to work on the same project but at different times. And for both of us, attuning to the space as we were starting out was a really important part of how we situated ourselves and how we really started to think about the research environment. So, Melissa, how do you go about attuning to space when you're first in a place?
Yes, so for the project that we did together, there were, I guess, 4 kinds of attunement, different to the moments of the project. So first I did it from the office, going through the materials of your ethnographic experience. So I looked at your videos, listened to your audios, read some of the notes, and that helped me to start familiarizing with what I could find. Then a second attunement was when I was going to do the field work. It was usually immersions of 1 week. So I would allow myself the first and second week just to be on the site and introduce myself and walk around and be sitting in the different spaces, but I would not do any interviews in those first couple of days. So that allowed me to recognize a bit of the sensory stimulus, the people, the interactions, and some of the routines. Then when the moment came for the interviews, there was an attunement with the research participant together, and it depended of where the interview was happening, what kind of conversations we were having, if someone interrupted or something like a sound, or it was raining really hard or really sunny. All of those kinds of things help in that moment of the attunement. And the fourth one was when I was back at the office looking at the materials of the experiences I had. So it was a bit like an attunement in retrospective that helped me prepare for the second round of immersion of things that when I was in the moment I was not necessarily aware, but with the distance I could find repetitions, and it also started to help with the analysis. So those were like 4 different kinds of attunement: from your materials, from the presence and not much interaction first couple of days, from the interviews with the participants, and in retrospective looking back at the materials.
It's so interesting that it was part of your reflection process, like the thing that came after. I've actually never thought of it like that before, as part of how you get into the analysis, like it's a bridge into the analysis by looking back at materials. I guess for me, I sort of realized when I was working on the same study that you then worked on, that you only get your first impression once. And so rather than try to rush into the research site and kind of get as much as I could, and it took me a while to figure out how to do this, I instead would try to choose a sort of an out-of-the-way spot, still central where there were things were happening, but an out-of-the-way spot where I could sit and kind of quietly get the feel of the site. So that didn't mean that I was kind of watching and trying to observe and remember everything. It was more like letting the first impressions kind of wash over me. And so that became, over time, I started to realize that what I was doing was noticing things and letting those kind of start to compose themselves into an understanding of the site. So rather than necessarily watching for specific things, I just let the noticing occur and bubble to the surface. And this of course, inevitably would change as I spent more time in the site, but those first impressions because they were my own, as an outsider, as someone who didn't know the space, because they were my own kind of noticings, became a good way into thinking about other people's ways of noticing the space, and also those kinds of threshold moments when you enter a space for the first time, how important those are for us, not just as researchers, but for our research participants as well, who might be coming into a space for the first time. So I wasn't quite as organized, I think, as you were, but I think that not watching for things, but just letting things come to notice is really powerful. Yeah.
And then how did that help you during the research? How were those moments of attunement helping the field work and then the analysis for you?
Yeah. So, I really think that attunement makes things possible in different and really interesting ways. So there are sort of three ways in which I think about what that kind of research material, as it were, can do for you by attuning. So the first thing is that it surfaces your own feelings and impressions in the research context. So you're kind of actively noticing. So that sort of also makes you take your feelings seriously. And sometimes these can be uncomfortable or maybe even unpleasant, often novel or unusual to you. But letting them kind of be noticed helps you to kind of identify them as something to think with. So for example, in one of the sites that I was in, there was quite a distinctive smell. And it wasn't a smell that I particularly liked or that was, particularly pleasant. It was the sort of smell of bodies and of cleaning fluid, cleaning products and, kind of slightly stale air. And this is just sort of part of what many interior spaces are like, especially, healthcare environments where, there's lots of different kind of chemical and body smells. And whilst I didn't like it actually, I realized that I had to just let myself sort of experience it, that it was an affordance of, it was part of being in the space, and it was an important sensory aspect. So acknowledging those impressions gives you something to work with. So that's the first step. The second step is that having those things to work with allows you to use them to set up an empathetic correspondence with your research participants. So you might be able to say to someone else, like in that context, perhaps a visitor to the space, do you notice the smell? What do you think of this? Or what other things can you smell? So it gives you a way to jump into kind of lines of inquiry with people. It also helped me think about what I wanted to purposefully observe for. So there was things that I could talk to people about, but also it made me think, oh, maybe smell is something I really need to think about, not just with research participants, but with my own kind of understanding of this site. And in fact, in that case, smell became one of the sort of central categories that I found analytically really interesting. So identifying things allows you both to fold them into your encounters with research participants, but also make them areas of focus for your own observations as you continue to work in a place. But what about you? How did attunement make things possible in your kind of ethnographic practice?
So very similar to what you were saying, the first impressions from watching your materials and then from actually going to the site, because I was going to visit a different site. So the first impressions I was able to see from your materials were of the people I was going to work with, that they didn't know me, but through the videos I got to be familiar with their faces, and then I knew to recognize them in the site, and I was a bit aware of them. Then to prepare myself somehow for the context, which obviously it's not possible to prepare because you never know what's going to happen in the moment. So it's more like setting the mood to the field work, and then to be aware of sensitivities of the site, that I needed to be prudent in some context or some questions, to reframe them in one way or another. And then to prepare the tools. So what tools did I need and how to carry them. So because of the sensitivity of the site, then we could not carry video cameras, but they were in a different kind of pocket. So all those kinds of things were possible through looking your materials. Then when I was at the site, the first impressions for myself made such an impression that the first night of the field work, I had a dream of walking through the corridor. And then that made me aware of those two things, the first impressions and how that continues to just grow on you. So I brought that question to my interactions with participants in the conversations we had. I would start with the introduction of the research and the kinds of conversations that we were going to have, but then prompt them about starting with their first impressions, because it situated us in the building to then start to talk about deeper layers of the senses of that building. And by the end of the interview, if the situation was possible, I would ask if they were comfortable to share if they had dreams. And I shared my personal experience. So in sharing that personal experience, as you said, there's this empathy of I'm not just interviewing you for you to give me information, but it's a dialogue of a common experience we are having in the site, which becomes a work site for the two of, like, the person you're interviewing, that's their work site in the case of staff, and it was for me as well in a different way. So that from the experience of the interviews, and that other 4 points of when I was back at the office, those experiences of the different sensory categories or the different interactions started to inform the conceptual categories. That, as you were saying, smell became an important category. For example, in my case, it was not necessarily smell because it was a completely new building, so smell was not as present, but the light was very present because it was very bright building, and the sounds because it had the new doors, and there was a different public announcement system that was connected to the whole hospital. So it was also a new category for the participants. So because it was my first time doing ethnographic research in a hospital, I took that for granted. And were they the ones that in the interviews made me aware of the sounds for their practice and for their everyday routines.
So attunement is really about, as we've been talking about it, it's really about how we as researchers come to know the site, but also as a jumping off point, whether it's through, the imagination or dreams or your own sensory, impressions. It's a jumping off point for being, not only doing the research, but also being with other people in the site as you do the research, to sort of enter into the site, in a particular kind of way.
And that makes me think of another important aspect of attunement, and it's, I don't know what would be the opposite, like disconnecting from that attunement. So being able to live those experiences in the field work, or close the door at the end of the day to those experiences, and
leave them behind.
So there was an important practice also of how do you say disattunement or
yeah, but distancing maybe.
Yeah. So I think those are important moments, that distancing, because it helps later when I'm looking back at the materials or I'm having conversations back with the same people to see them with different light.
All right, well, we'll come back to that idea of removing yourself from the field and also taking care of yourself as a researcher in another video, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for watching our video on attunement in ethnography. I'm Shanti Sumartayo.
I'm Melissa Duque. Thank you.
We'll see you next time.